with that, let's go ahead and get started. Great to have those who have joined, and as a reminder, these will be posted on Industry Lab's website, so they will be referenced in the future. I know that there's a few folks that wanted to join that weren't able to. So please feel free to share that. We'll get those posted in about a week after this event. So thanks all for joining. I'm excited to introduce Mike Vasquez. If you haven't already met him, he's the founder and CEO of 3 Degrees and a key part of supporting this Industry Labs Additive Accelerator. Mike has a deep experience, knowledge. He'll be modest, but he has a deep knowledge specifically when it comes to the material side of additive. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, specifically into 3D printed materials and how they compare to traditional manufacturer materials and what that means for things like performance, cost, and selection. As just a reminder, if you're evaluating parts or processes or additive technologies related to this technology, please feel free to reach out to Mike and myself. We're closing to the end of this accelerator program, but it's not too late to get in contact. With that, Mike and I have some really exciting news to share about an upcoming event on March 3rd. We're doing an additive manufacturing showcase where we're bringing in American makes. They'll be speaking about the national additive manufacturing landscape relative to not just DoD, but also a national perspective of what's happening there. If you're not familiar with American makes, I encourage you to check their website out. Pretty impressive organization that Mike has been a part of for some time. And then we'll have a regional perspective, kind of having a fireside chat and hearing from a few local industry leaders and also Ed Kittel at the University of Notre Dame. And that will be followed by an optional tour of CTS. And that will be their additive lab and a few other facilities within CTS. That event is March 3rd, 8:30 to noon. If you're interested in attending, please reach out to me. My email's there, and you guys all have it anyways. But feel free to reach out to me and get registered as we're looking to close that up here shortly. With that, Mike, if there's anything I missed, please feel free to chime in. But thanks for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for joining. Excited about the challenge of and breadth of what we have to talk about today. So I'm going to focus on, here we go, kind of 3D printing materials overview. This is, we could spend 8 hours on a short course on this, but I want to give you kind of the high level kind of considerations and kind of takeaways that would be kind of good to understand as you think about wherever you are in your AM journey, whether that's kind of looking at outsourcing, bringing new materials in, or evaluating whether any of your current processes could be augmented by additive manufacturing or 3D printing. So I'll kind of start with some little bit of background, but there we go. So as Michael mentioned, I've met a few of you on the call, but my name is Mike Vasquez. I run kind of 2 different companies, both AM focused, one called 3 Degrees, which I started about 12 years ago, and then another called Vasquez Engineering Consulting, which we do kind of a lot of work in the actual materials development space for a number of machine manufacturers, material suppliers, and end users in the 3D printing space. So this is kind of my deeper expertise in the space. But as a materials engineer by background, how I got my start in the AM sector was really on developing powdered materials that were elastomeric in nature for 3D printing. Oftentimes you think of 3D printing on the plastic side of kind of rigid kind of parts. I have a bunch next to me that I wanted to kind of bring out, but you think of parts that are kind of rigid, like they're just hard plastic, like a nylon or an ABS or something like that. But there's thousands of different parts or different capabilities that injection molding covered, and traditional manufacturing processes covered. Not a lot in the softer, flexible materials, and kind of where I got my start was with developing new powders for that. So having done that before, we've over the last 15 years have brought materials to market, helped get them cleared for medical device applications and aerospace applications and a whole range of different capabilities all on the 3D printing front. So I like to keep these pretty informal. I'll have a lot of content and can go into a lot of different rabbit holes. But if you do have specific questions, I've got my screen up here. So if you want to throw them in the chat or something like that, I don't mind kind of going off on tangents, and I often think that's very useful. Kind of depending on what people have on their mind on the day. So, so kind of key goals for today. One, just understand what's currently available in the AM materials landscape, and kind of discussing what's the art of the possible. And then more so in terms of how do you succeed in kind of going down that path and evaluating the AM materials. What do you need to consider? What are some of the drawbacks? How does costing influence that? And we'll take a brief tangent down things like mechanical properties or properties that you might expect out of 3D printing materials versus what you'd find traditionally. So it's a huge topic, right? I think even if any of us kind of discuss just on metals, right? Like, are we comparing versus machined or forged or wrought? And same on the polymer side. Are we comparing 3D printing to injection molding or other sorts of plastic? So I'll do my best to kind of synthesize it down into some kind of key takeaways that you can just like rules of thumb that you can think about. And then if we have specific questions, I'm always available and happy to sit down and talk about anything in more detail or if you have a question. So just some context of kind of where is 3D printing in the grand scheme of things. So it's roughly kind of a 24 to $25 billion market. If we think about more general manufacturing and all the available processing capabilities out there, that's kind of less than 5%, probably even less than that. And I think it has seen steady growth, but over time, it's kind of matured into kind of a process like machining or like injection molding, where companies or service bureaus is what they kind of term them in the 3D printing space, are basically job shops. You can send your part there; they'll manufacture it in kind of the 3D printing approach, and go from there. There are a number of companies that bring that technology in-house. In some cases, but for the most part, a lot of this growth is driven by people producing 3D printed parts and in some cases selling machines.
Mike, based on that, are you saying that the majority of that market is based on actually the production of parts versus actually the selling of 3D printers?
It's moving that way now. So I would say 5 years ago was probably selling machines and software and the other ancillary processes. But I would say now the maturity of the market is really going towards people producing parts with it, either as an in-house shop or kind of an external 3D printing capability. So, and that is driven primarily by, we understand the materials more, we understand kind of qualification, we understand kind of what the performance looks like, and understand kind of an assessment of the cost perspective. But yeah, it is trending that way. We were just down at a show called Military Additive Manufacturing 2 weeks ago, and that was the real big theme was, and I'm sure something Kimberly will talk about in a couple of weeks at the AM event, is kind of, it's not so much of an R&D exercise for companies. It's like, okay, hey, we see the use cases for this. We're just going to kind of go all in on having someone produce parts for us or not. I'm not saying that is widespread. That's
Yeah.
probably the opposite of what I'm saying, but it's more, it's not as experimental as it was previously, at least on the real kind of high end building out products. However, on the flip side, I think the other aspect of it that is like the emergence of things like the Bamboo Labs kind of desktop FDM that's very high quality. Has like every shop that I've gone into in the last 18 months has had one of those. I mean, I've got one behind me. Um, they're good machines. Like it makes it, at least on the prototyping side, and maybe light production, much easier to at least enter and have some capability in house. So I think that's also a big difference. So, um, yeah, and so I mean, I think those of you who are on here, I won't kind of belabor this, but like, why do people go for 3D printing? Like, there are a number of different materials. Mainly, it's lead time reduction or supply chain augmentation. Tooling are the other kind of big areas that we see a lot. But ultimately, it comes back down to kind of what's the cost advantage? Can I get it faster? Do I have more design capabilities? Am I able to augment in a cheaper material or something like that? And kind of go from there. So when we get to materials, right, I think the where I want to start with is kind of there's kind of four basic types of modalities that we think about in the 3D printing material space, and that's a lot driven by what the feedstock looks like. And so, what is it that the material looks like when it goes into the printer? So, many of you are probably familiar with the filament-based processes, FDM, fused deposition modeling, things like that. Um, Primarily plastic-based, but when you think about it, like what's the original format of that? Usually it's pellets that like polymer. Like if you run an injection molding shop or something like that, your raw feedstock and your kind of high throughput feedstock is going to be pellets. So with filaments, you have to start with a pellet and then go to a filament, which adds cost, which we'll talk about in a second. The second area, more for prototyping, I would say, is kind of what liquid resin. Um, and so very expensive in terms of raw materials, mostly on the polymer, kind of think thermoset type of materials. Sometimes it's used for kind of softer, pliable materials. It's often seen in footwear and things like that. But pretty expensive material, not a lot of high throughput applications other than dental applications where that's often used. And then primarily where we work, or where we see the most development is in the powder space for kind of more production applications of 3D printing. And that's primarily because you can get feedstock that is mimics or is exactly what you would think of in traditional manufacturing processes. So say what you would typically order off um, a traditional metal alloy, 17.4, stainless 316, Inconel, Ti-6.4. On the polymer side, it's kind of PA12 and and a few others. But on the powder side, kind of the what kind of key takeaway number one for today is that because 3D printing requires unique feedstocks, or that aren't what you would traditionally see as what would go into an injection molding machine or a metal injection molding machine or die casting or things like that, or even casting. Um, the the process or the preparation of making that feedstock is what ultimately drives up cost. And so for kind of the key takeaway is that in most cases, if I'd say 95% of cases, 3D printing feedstock is going to be more expensive than what you would traditionally buy if you're just machining something, if you're just injection molding it. And so with that, all of your kind of calculations and kind of mental models probably hinge on that part where you're starting with something more expensive to, even though if it's the same alloy, if it's the same polymer, and kind of going from there. So there's a lot of reasons why it's more expensive to make these powders or make these filaments. A lot of kind of process control, a lot of specs that you need to follow to make sure they work in the machine and you get ultimately the right part out. But I think when you're thinking about how to kind of come to justify the use of additive manufacturing, I think that's something to think about. that spread is getting better, and I'll show you some graphs in a second of what that looks like. But um, it still remains the case that these materials are more expensive. That being said, I mean, on the material side, on the metals, where we see most of the use cases, um, steel, kind of 17.4, 316, Inconel, so like high temperature super alloys for kind of production of airline parts, Ti 6.4 in the medical space and aerospace, are kind of the big winners in the space. Like the between those kind of three alloy families, that probably covers most of it. There is some aluminum printing. It's an aluminum silicon magnesium alloy. It's not kind of what not like a 6066 where you would typically see like in a in a conventional kind of space. So it's a little bit off what you would normally expect if you haven't used a printed alloy before, aluminum before. But kind of gives you these images here, kind of give you some sense of where the big use cases are. So it's implants, it's suppressors on the bottom there, and then a variety of aerospace components that are fairly complex. Are kind of the big applications of end use AM parts, and then a little bit of tooling and things like that on the steel side where you can have small inserts and conformal cooling. But ultimately, if you look at all these parts, right, they're fairly well customized. They have unique features, things you can't do on machining, things you can't um, do otherwise. And so you can pay that extra money for the parts or for the raw feedstock and kind of still get value out of it. And this is kind of a breakdown of kind of where the market is in terms of usage. So it's about kind of 60% between steel-based or iron-based and nickel-based alloys, and then kind of backfilled with titanium and aluminum. There are some other alloys out there, more like high-temperature refractory alloys, maybe even copper as well, but much more niche. Copper is a challenging alloy to use just because of how reflective it is. Same with aluminum. Most of these metal processes use a laser to melt the material. If you're shining a bright laser onto something that's shiny, it's going to do all sorts of reflective things that aren't great with melting and consolidation. So those metals aren't as well used in the industry. But that's changing a little bit. There's some different laser technology, green lasers that allow different absorption to different wavelengths, allow some of those different materials as well. But just kind of gives you a sense of if you're looking out in terms of, hey, maybe we can explore this a little bit. Those are the typical alloys that you have available on the metal side. And this is just kind of a rough kind of comparison of like how much is an AM feedstock versus a traditional feedstock, and this is rough. This is kind of versus like wrought or um, some generic alloys. So don't hold me to one exact on this, but it gives you kind of a sense that producing titanium powders is more expensive than just buying nominal feedstock. Interesting, like Inconel 718 has kind of a um, reverse case where kind of some of the traditional formats that you would get that material are more expensive. Just in that really comes down to heat treatment and things you have to do with the traditional material that you're baking into the powder process anyways. But most of these materials are gas atomized by companies like Carpenter or Linde or Praxair. And that's kind of the where the kind of the breakdown comes. But if you look at some of the steels, they're not crazy difference in terms of cost. One to
Mike,
one.
what's the uh, why is titanium such a drastic cost different? What's like the material property that makes that so much more
I think this
challenging?
this is like a rough estimate. I would probably put that. I mean, it's still going to be more expensive, but I think um, oftentimes what you see in the the medical like medical and aerospace are the ones that are driving titanium, and so they're pretty particular on the feedstock format, particle size distribution, purity, and things like that
Mm.
with the powders also to make it run effectively. So
Would you
you can,
just would you say the same thing but the opposite with Inconel?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, but I think comparatively, if we were to think about like maturity of all these alloys, Inconel very mature. A lot of the steel is pretty mature in terms of additive. Even the titaniums are pretty mature. Like there are probably people that have titanium implants that are 3D printed in them. Um, you've probably flown on a plane that has an Inconel engine component at some point produced by GE. So a lot of these materials have been matured into the space, but the scale isn't quite there yet to drive the price down. So um, then on the polymer side, I know I'll leave a few minutes for time, but I want to at least get through this. But a lot more diversity on polymers in terms of generally what's available at a prototyping level, not so much on a production level. So there are softer materials, there are kind of rigid components, there are different examples that um, come to mind, whether that's kind of the majority of the AM space at the production level and kind of what people are making money off of are PA12, so nylon 12 or polyamide 12. The rest of these are mostly kind of ABS and Ultem, PLA. Those are probably more on the filament side of things. And things you could produce in your bamboo printer, even the nylon you can produce in your bamboo printer or kind of desktop. But on the powder side is primarily PA12, and PA11, a little bit of peak and peck in terms of market share on that side. What you don't see a lot of are your kind of big commodity plastics like HDPE, polypropylene, PA6, like things that like you'd see a lot in automotive, just don't play nicely with 3D printing capability, like the machines. So that's one thing that's kind of been holding the polymer market back at least. So a lot of times when you think automotive, right, you think PA6 or polypropylene, people end up going more towards PA12 because it's printable, not so much because it's a one-to-one match, which makes it difficult when you're thinking about substituting parts or substituting um, uh, or going through the kind of the design process with changing materials. We're doing that. We're doing a project with another company now where traditionally their parts are injection molded PA6. They just use it for the tensile strength and the cost, but their supplier went out of business, and now we're looking to produce those with PA12 material. It hits the requirements of mechanical strength, but it's different, right? And so I think it requires more of a more of a bespoke quality evaluation than you would think. So same idea here. So obviously probably more pronounced in some ways, like producing powders and filaments is going to be more expensive than your traditional pellets. And so where you can produce mostly any polymer less than probably $5 a pound on pellets, you're going to see kind of grades of filaments and powders $50 to $60 per kg. So again, this is where some of the challenges of the 3D printing space come in, where you have to kind of lock into that idea that hey, the feedstock is going to be more expensive, and then kind of go from there. And just for kind of ballpark idea of like how should I think about costing if I'm making my mental model, and this is what I've always used, is roughly one third or I would say kind of a quarter of your cost, your end part cost is going to be from the machine and operator cost. Another quarter is going to be from some of the post processing and things like that, and then probably 40 to 50% of it is going to be your raw material feedstock cost. So that's going to be a primary driver for overall kind of cost of your material. So if you can kind of get that down, that decreases your overall kind of compensation. But I wanted to share some things out there, like just for like how do you think about mechanical properties? How do you think about standards and whatnot? But there are existing standards out there and databases that allow you to search some of the mechanical properties. We don't have time to go through kind of all these mechanical properties now, but um, some of these are available where like GM has published a spec on using PA12 in a 3D printing process. And so they list all the standards that they've tested across um, tensile tests and compression tests and um, bend tests and all that. Um, how do they think about kind of benchmarking with um, uh, CMM and things like that? So there are things available. Same idea with, I'll kind of go to this one on kind of raw databases on looking up like, hey, we want to understand what's available for PA PA12 or PA6 or TI64. There's two databases that I'd like to point you to. One is called the Senval database. So basically, you can sort by material or machine and start to get an idea and kind of lock down, kind of just in a tabular format is like, okay, hey, I want to see all the titanium alloys and I want to see what kind of the average elongation or modulus is of all these. So this is a free service. You can go on and sendball.com and check that out. UL. So
For those, I just interrupt for a second. With regard to printed metals, could you touch on maybe just very briefly the difference between traditionally produced, say, bar stock versus printed in terms of things like the yield strength, tensile strength, modulus, and things like that?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Um, Let me just, so the other one that you can search is the UL yellow card or blue card. So that'll give you another database. So in terms of properties on the metal side, um, the primary drawback for some of these, the material properties for a lot of these parts tend to be the porosity in that's created in the 3D printing process. For a lot of the mature metal technologies, you're getting kind of over 99% dense components. So fundamentally, like the um, your at cast or wrought kind of performances in terms of properties, that varies a little bit, kind of depending on kind of part orientation. I would say you're still always building these layer by layer, and so sometimes you will see a difference in strength in the kind of up down direction versus the planar direction. So most of these databases kind of take that into account. A lot of the metals aren't actually that bad in terms of anisotropy between kind of X, Y, and Z directions, um, but for some of the mature technologies, it's pretty close. There's still where I think the challenges become is sometimes in fatigue, uh, and properties like that, where the surface roughness of the parts can impact the fatigue resistance of the components. But mechanical strengths, things like that, are fairly close. So, but again, come down to settings, come down to part geometry, things like that. So yeah, and I know we only have a few more minutes here, but yeah, that was kind of wrapping up, and I thought maybe one or two more questions. I saw someone in the chat, but oh, there we go. So Michael put the Senval.com database in the chat if you guys want to check that out. Also, feel free to email me directly with questions, shoot me a text. I'm also up at Innovation Park. I'll be at that event in a couple weeks as well. So a lot of ways to get a hold of me if you have more specific questions. But again, we could go into way more detail on any of these or any different alloy families. It's like you'd imagine, kind of asking the question like, hey, let's cover injection molding materials, right? Like it's a whole thing to go through all those. But hopefully it gave you kind of a few primers on what to think about. But really just think about the raw feedstock for 3D printing is different than you would have for traditional manufacturing, which makes the underlying costs more expensive. That kind of drives a lot of the use cases, and underlying price of parts. So yeah, so I think we're at 30 minutes, but if I can stick around for a few more minutes for questions or anything else that people may want to discuss.
Well, again, thanks so much, Mike. If there's any questions, feel free to jump on before we or send Mike or myself an email. But March 3rd, we're having that Additive Manufacturing Showcase event. If you're interested in attending, please reach out to me and I'll get you added to the I'll get you registered for the event. Thanks again, Mike, for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, everyone.